Okay, welcome back to the channel, everyone. Once again, I am joined by the estimable James Elmslie, coming over from Scotland. If you haven't already had the chance to to watch the first part of the series, we covered the topic of the medieval falchion, which is a favorite sword of mine. And that video was spectacular. But there was so much to discuss, talking about James Elmslie's work on the topic of single-edged medieval arms, that we discussed how we were going to make this a multi-part series. So, in anticipation of that, this is the second installment of the series. Now, we already discussed falchions specifically, and now we're going to talk about the kind of cousin of the falchion, the messer. So, Mr. Elmslie, what exactly is a messer, and why are we here today, and why couldn't it be discussed with falchions?
2 hours later. So, the two are certainly related. They're single-edged arms, but they are very distinct in being different groups of weapons, both in geography and chronology. The falchion, as I sort of mentioned, first appears around 1225, give or take 10 years, and the messer doesn't really appear until around 1400, give or take, maybe 5 years or so. Um, so there's a long period where the falchion is the only single-edged weapon which exists. They also have different geographical areas. The falchion I would often describe as being Western European, or mostly Western European, whereas the messer, it's often described as German. I don't feel that's really accurate. I feel that it is a Central European weapon. You find it in the Czech Republic, in Poland, in Romania, Hungary, and Germany, and much more widespread than the falchion was in many ways. So the two need to be looked at as groups in different ways. The more significant difference is that they are manufactured in completely different fashions. Messer just means knife, and that in itself should give a bit of a hint of what it is. If a falchion is a sword-like construction made of a tang, a pommel, and a crossguard, the messer is made completely differently. It has a wide slab of a tang, normally, not always, with wooden scales on either side. The construction is completely different. There are riveted sections rather than the peened ends you get. So each one is made completely different. And when I originally did a typological classification, I set it up with a prefix of either F or M for falchion or messer to sort of really define the construction technique which was used. As time's gone on, I'm less certain about that. It's definitely a Venn diagram where the two intersect, and you get there is a fuzzy ground between them where there are odd which don't quite fit into either category. But as a general introductory sort of 101 on the subject, falchions are made like swords. Messers are made like large bowing. And they do, in fact, start off very much as the size of a bowing knife or something like that. And they only get larger over the course of approximately 100 years of development and their rise in fashion and social status, which I think is the other area which differentiates them. The falchion is definitely a military weapon. It's one used by knights, men-at-arms, professional soldiery, whereas the messer seems to have been a civilian weapon, a knife carried on the hip as a day-to-day object, which grows bigger and becomes a fighting.
So just to make sure that I have the story straight, when we had discussed the falchion in the previous video, you mentioned how it basically shows up on the scene almost fully formed. It starts off as a sword, a single-edged sword in the 13th century, without any real antecedent in its developmental process. It harkens back to some earlier single-edged designs of centuries previous, but it is its own distinct thing. Whereas the Messer, you're saying, even though, as we will perhaps see later, it can share blade types perhaps with falchions, it doesn't really start off as a sword per se. It develops into a sword.
Yeah, I think there is definitely a fashion for them becoming bigger. I sort of imagine people saying, "Yeah, I like this. Can you make it a bit bigger?" And then another half a generation later, "I like this. Can you make it a bit bigger? I like this. Can you make it bigger?" You can imagine the sort of the fashionable taste of the era means that the hilt becomes popular as a style, and it develops over time as a result. I think that's part of what causes some of the confusion about it, is we have lots and lots of different names. There's Messer, there's Langusmesser, Grossmesser, Kriegsmesser, but there's no actual period text which describes these at all. So we're just left with these phrases. Were they used in period? Were they used to differentiate? Nobody really knows. I know that we have fighting manual. Codex Wallerstein has the phrase Langus Messer written, and you can read it clearly in medieval High Swabian as part of the text there. Unfortunately, then we get the translations of it, and a lot of those were done by Polish hymn groups, and Jeffrey Forgang, who worked with them in this. And they've translated it as falchion, despite the fact that you can read it clearly as saying Langus. You'll read the books of it. You've got the image on one side, the text written, handwritten on there, and the translation, and it'll say also dos thus so Langus Messer, and so with the falchion. So there is a confusion in modern language as to what these even are, and different regions will call them different things, much more so than falchion, which has a few variations around. You've got Icelandic, for instance. We find them being described as sax, in the same way that you would a 10th century weapon completely unrelated to them. In Dutch, it's Mess, which means knife. German, Messer, knife. In some parts of Poland, it will be called translated to falchion, or it could be cord or cordi. So there are many, many different phrases all around them. And this is one of the areas which causes confusion about.
So we were talking about it being a variety of different terms for it. You mentioned that they have different terms in Poland, and it's worth, or that the translation of the codex was done by the Polish group, but they are found even in Poland, correct? I think cord is the term that's used in Poland.
Yeah, the geography of Messers is quite amazing. I think they originated in center of Europe, Switzerland and Austria, so Dau and those sort of regions. And from there, they spread outwards. And it's part of the economic trade routes of medieval society. And you can sort of use those to track where they spread. So they cross over to the Elbe River, and then they head up north. So that heads to Hamburg and Lübeck, and from there you find them in Estonia and Lithuania, Latvia, in Sweden. None found in Norway, but there's very, very few Norwegian medieval in general. You find a few in Denmark. You find them in Iceland, which is indicative of the trade routes of the Hansa trade network, which spread out from the Baltic. At the same time, they're crossing over by the relatively short land route to the Danube, and then heading downriver. And so you see them going into Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, even as far as Ukraine. You find a few examples of slightly different messers. They're much more of a rounded tip in that area. There's a regional fashion going. You then go into Slovenia and you find a massive collection of archaeology in the river Ljubljana, I believe it's pronounced. I've probably mangled that. Sorry for anyone who's from Slovenia. And you find the messers there. There's one or two in the very north. They're not very common. So there's a sort of a border with the Alps, which is limiting sort of migration. But you see them heading from Slovenia into the Balkan states, Croatia, Serbia, and that sort of region. And a few of them spread west through Western Germany. I suspect they're probably being copied by the Smiths in Solingen, as was traditional for Passau and Solingen, having a sort of industrial fight of espionage at any moment in time. So they're copied, and they end up being shipped down the Rhine, and they head into the Netherlands, Belgium, Burgundy, and northern France. So there's a very widespread geographical spread here. One of the interesting bits which is noticed is they don't seem to reach the British Isles. I am tempted to sort of observe that as being an indication of sort of British people being difficult and thinking that they have to do things on their own. This is one of the dangers of history and archaeology. You end up taking interpretation from modern society, desperately trying to avoid that. But it's definitely a case that there were single-edged swords and single-edged knives in British circulation, which have similar details to messers, but done differently. So, for instance, most messers have a small projection called a nagel, nail, which sticks out the side of it. In Britain, that was done as a cast bronze piece with the same little projection. So they're copying the idea, but they have to do it their way.
Now, we have one rather large piece in the Royal Armouries collection, if I recall correctly, and we believe that that was a gift, perhaps, to Henry VIII.
Yes, definitely a gift from Maximilian II, I think it was. Might have been the first, I don't remember. But that's definitely a Flemish style. It doesn't have the nagel, which is more common on Central European example. And it's missing the end cap, which unfortunately all the replicas have made have not bothered to do the research on. Probably I understand why, though, because it is described as being in one illustration, but I've managed to find the book. I've never managed to find the illustration. So I think if I was making the you do the same thing. It's one of those sort of little details which we know something was there, but is now lost.
So a couple of questions immediately spring to mind that anyone who follows Messers at least tangentially might have. One is how then do they so immediately become associated with Germany? Now, we've talked in the past about the difficulties with researching Eastern European arms and armor, although this seems to be a much later development since Messers were almost kind of unknown if we go back even 15 or 20 years. So this is, post
Yes,
Iron
yeah,
Curtain sort of thing. Um, is it that we're looking at Germany was perhaps being a producer of these arms and exporting them to the surrounding regions, or is it just survivorship bias for written sources, things like Paulus Hector Mayer, who the reason that we have so many original sources is because he went around and collected them all for us, and that's why we have so
yes.
many German sources compared to everywhere else.
All praise his tax collecting and fraud. Where would we be without him?
Yes.
Yeah, Paulus Hector Mayer, in fact, was one of the owners of the Codex Wallerstein.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
His initials are on the front page. Um, I think a little bit of it is that they were never really looked at, never
Mm-hmm.
really noticed. Um, I know Herbert Seitz, for example, doesn't even mention. They're just sort of sword,
Mm.
unusual sword. It's just brushed off. Um, Other sources, the Fechtbuch really become known 25 years ago or thereabouts. I still remember back in the Paleolithic where we dodgy photocopies of 133 and the likes, and we hadn't really considered that these were different in any way. And I must admit, when I started doing this, messers were barely even known, and
Mm.
the construction differences weren't really understood. Um, so much so that the first time I got my hands on it in Glasgow museums, I looked at it, I turned it around, and I saw these lines about crossguard, and I thought that they were just corrosion pattern of a you know rusting over decades of a in wrought iron. It wasn't until I started to study more of it I discovered the the fact that Messer crossguards slide on from the blade
Mm.
rather than going down. So the first one I made, I was sort of doing it like a normal sword. And nobody knew any better. Well, Peter Johnson probably knew better because it was Peter. But, the rest of us mere mortals had no idea, the fine details of what we were doing. And so all this sort of stuff has had to be searched out and discovered completely from scratch, not just by myself, by all the other people who've been working over the last decades or so. And that has really meant being a very sort of fresh look at it. Whereas stuff like sword making, people sort of knew how it was done before and they've been able to work on it. For this, we really had to start from absolute basic principles and try and sort of understand what was going on at all with these objects.
Yeah, so there's the old joke that you can always tell a sword that's been made by a dedicated knife maker, because if you try and just take a knife and scale it up to the size of a sword, things tend to not work right. So how do you go about making a messer? What makes a messer a messer?
For production, how these would be made, the first thing we start off with is geometry. Um, the medieval society is built around geometry. I will put up a screen here, which is a picture of God as the geometer creating the earth. And you'll see he's depicted here holding a pair of compass,
Hmm.
drawing out the radius of the earth. And this is something which is inherent in medieval society. It's used in churches, in designing of buildings. It's used in swordsmithing. It's used in jewelry. There is a surviving manuscript by Hans Schmuttermeyer, which talks about design of jewelry and goldsmithing, and it's all written in terms of geometry and proportion
Mm.
and scale. So this is something which is consistent in the medieval mindset. It's something which we as a society have somewhat lost because we have standardized units, whereas they had entirely different units of measurement in different regions. Um, a wonderful example of that is the warship Vasa,
Mm.
which was built in Sweden, but also included French shipwrights. And apparently they worked on one side of the ship, whilst the Swedish shipwrights worked on the other side. And the example of this is that they found the rulers in the ship from the measurements, and the French inch and the Swedish inch are two entirely different measurements. And the net result is that one side of the ship was made probably about 10% thicker.
Oh no.
And as a result, the ship managed to get probably about 2 miles out from the harbour before it capsized in
Yep.
front of everybody, including the king. Um, a wonderful example of disaster management, but it also displays the problem of units of measurement,
Mm.
whereas a proportion doesn't really have that problem. So if you're making a full length sword or a messer, you would probably start by working with probably a board or a table. You would lay out a straight line on it, and then you would use your compass and you would draw in your design, cutting it in as probably, in the case of messers, a proportional ratio. Um, Often these are quite irrational numbers, so you
Mm.
get a length of a hilt to the blade, which is, say, 2 to 11 or
Mm.
2 to 9. Um, and if you think about proportions, a 2 to 9 will have a shorter blade than 2 to 11,
Right.
unless you make the proportion of each individual circle larger, in which case you can end up with a bigger weapon with a longer hilt. So there is a variation going on in there. And that would allow you to design your weapon to whatever sort of ratios and what percentages you really want in a way which is easily reproduced. And the thing to remember there is that these are not a single weapon that's
Mm-hmm.
being made. These are products of industrial manufacturing in mass production. Um, they're probably making at least batches of 12, possibly batches of 20, or even 144, a gross
Yeah.
of swords at a time. And these are heavily industrialized groups which are producing separate components and separate pieces, all working together to produce finished pieces. There's often the myth of the blacksmith working alone, and it's nothing like that. You have in cities like Passau and Zongen entire factories specializing in one single area of production. So you'll have one area or one company which is doing the forging, producing rough blanks. You'll have another one who are solely doing the grinding. They'll have great big water wheel grinders and dozens of people working away, grinding away every single day. And then you have the cutlers who are making the hilt fittings. And then you have the sheathers who are making the leather sheaths to carry these in. Each of those is an individual industry, an individual company working separately from the
Mm-hmm.
others. So this is a massive infrastructure. The idea of the lone blacksmith is so far removed. To make a medieval sword, it's probably passing through maybe 30 or 40 people's
Right.
hands. And that changes the dynamic of the entire industry. So having these consistent designs makes sense. And there might be little variations in a batch,
Right.
but the overall theme is there. And this is one of the things which I found in the research work is that you will find examples of what I would call a family.
Mm.
And they're obviously based off the same sort of basic principles. Um, so, as a good example, there's one in Lubeck, one in Malbork, one in Innsbruck, and another in Iceland, in Reykjavik. All the same sort of messer.
Mm.
And so it's pretty obvious to me that this group were all manufactured, if not in the same workshop, then certainly in the same sort of period of time, being influenced by each other and possibly by the same blade makers being shipped out, so that the little differences of hilts were different companies doing the cutler's work.
Mm-hmm.
So this sort of indicates the scale of the industry that's going on in medieval Central Europe. And as I say, they're Passau and Solingen, they are German manufactured, and
Right.
that's partly why people call these German as a group.
Now, because of what you just described, this makes my next question going to be much more. Muddies the water quite a bit, and it's going to make it much more difficult to answer. But there has been a lot of conjecture as to why these became so popular, especially among, shall we say, the either the burghers or even perhaps lower than that, among peasants. Um,
Yeah.
it there's two aspects to this. So one would be the question of if there's a legal component to it. Two would be a question of, as you just described, if perhaps these were different production lines. So perhaps one guild was in charge of creating Messer-like swords, and another one was creating other more militaristic-like swords. It Something else to consider is and you're perhaps better at answering this than I do, than I am, but I believe that the timeline is correct for the co-occurrence of popularity of civilians carrying very large double-edged blades such as Basilard and Dagon right around the same time that flirt with becoming as long as swords as well. So there seems to
Yes.
be this whole idea that, oh, look, officer, it's not actually a sword, it's just a dagger that I happen to have that's occurring
Well,
across Europe in general around this time.
I'll start with the easiest part
Sure.
of that, which is the different companies or different guilds making different blades. We definitely have messers which are inlaid with the maker's mark of the running wolf of Passau,
Mhm.
which is indicative that these were the same companies who
Mm.
are making them. So there's been a lot of speculation over the years, and I mean, I've participated in that speculation as well. Someday, some poor sod is going to have to do their PhD by digging their way through medieval High German legal documents
Mm.
which have survived in some of the city states and try and find if there are examples of court cases
Mm.
for the copying of blades or the, how should we put this, the overstepping of the limits of sword making and knife making guilds. Um, Whoever does that is going to be a hero. Um, it's not going to be me. I don't speak medieval German well enough to be able to even think about doing that sort of thing. But somewhere out there. Now, the difficulty, of course, is proving a negative. If we
Mm.
can't find those, then we're going to have to assume that it's mostly a made up myth.
Mm.
But until somebody does, we don't know. Um, I think that it has been heavily exaggerated. And It's definitely the case that the "oh no, officer, it's not a sword, it's a knife" is another modern reflection of our mentality. It's kind of sticking it to the man, isn't it?
Mm.
It's being able to get around the law. It's sort of it's what everybody wants to do when they get caught for speeding or something. Oh no, no, officer, I was actually doing 68.8, or something like this. And I think that's a reflection of us. And one of the reasons that I think is likely evidenced is we have surviving examples of measures which were
Mm-hmm.
used to measure the length of a weapon against the incomers to a city. You read Ambit Leslie's the martial ethic in medieval Europe, for instance. If you enter a city, you were expected to present your weapons, show that they were of suitable length to be carried, and if they weren't, then they were to be stored in your place of residence. If you didn't have a place of residence, then you would be in trouble as well. Um, but the example of that is one of the Dutch cities. It might have been Leiden or the likes. Um, the measure has survived, and it's a forged wrought iron blade, right, this sort of long,
Mm-hmm.
and it's in the shape of a messer. So it's clearly they're showing a messer here. It's not just a sword. Knives which are longer than this are too long as well.
Mm-hmm.
Other examples which have survived are just a steel rule with a marker on it. But that one is quite outstanding as an example of this. And I think that illustrates that the whole length restriction is a size thing, not a type thing, and that they were less concerned about what type of weapon it was as much as the dimensions of it. Um, but that then raises the question: why do these sort of become popular?
Mm-hmm.
And I think in many ways the simplest answer for it is fashion.
Yeah.
Um, and that's one of the most understated parts of medieval arms and armor in general is the study of fashion of design of fashion of armaments. Um, if you take a Type 15 sword, that blade from 1300 when they first appeared is fundamentally exactly the same as one in the War of the Roses 150 years
Mm.
later. But the hilt will have changed. Does it make it better? No, not
Mm.
really. What is making it better is how it looks on the hip to the people who are carrying it. And fashion is irrational. It's not a logical process. Um, you just need to walk down the street and you'll see, some 20-year-old girl wearing jeans which are ripped open at the moment. And that's fashionable. And I've seen it with knees literally flopping out of the trousers because they're so ripped. That wouldn't have been fashionable 30 years ago.
Mm.
But on a guy, it would have been wearing his denim jeans with ripped jeans. So a fashion there has risen up, fallen out of fashion, come back again, in this case, for a completely different gender.
Mm.
Um, everything which shapes clothing, military armament, society in general is driven by fashions of what people consider to be the optimum or the acceptable of society at any moment in time. I've used this example before, but there is a wonderful example of one of the Holy Roman emperors
Mm.
who had bunions. And
Mm.
as a result, he couldn't wear the tightly narrow pointed krakows, which were the fashion of the time. So he had to wear broad, what they call bare paw shoes, so he could walk in comfort. Now, nobody obviously wanted to insult the emperor by wearing a type of shoe that was fashionable and he couldn't wear. So what do? They start copying him. And soon it becomes fashionable to be wearing it, and the emperor is leading the fashion. And within 20 years, you're seeing this change in metal sabatons as well.
Mm.
Doesn't make any difference to the performance, but you're seeing a reflection of the fashion. You get amazing examples of harnesses of armor which are made in the style of Landsknecht clothing, where it's etched and then gilded so that the cuts and slashes in the fabric are replicated in steel. That's fashion. That's somebody who wants to show off that they have the most fashionable taste. And I think that's one of the most important things which hasn't really been looked at in medieval society is how it develops because of this irrational taste for fashions.
And I think
And I
that the
think
case
that,
that you have here with the Messer is particularly interesting because I think that you have demonstrated pretty convincingly that there is a progression of adoption of the Messer that is uh, a uh, a bottom to top progression through
yes,
society,
definitely.
which is a kind of reverse fashion development than most of. It's not to say that that always happens, that never happens. There's plenty of peasant foods and things that eventually make their way all the way up through high society. But I think it's much more common to say, as does the king, so does the rest of the country follow.
Yeah,
And this is one
it's
where it seems to
definitely,
start. It's not a falchion that starts off as a very high status knightly weapon. You're saying that it basically starts as kind of a peasant knife, correct?
yes, absolutely. It starts off as the small lower class. Um, I'll show an example of this here from the Universität Bibliothek Heidelberg, which has one of the very early images from the Apostolica Vaticania, um, one of the first depictions of a very early messer, quite a small piece, and it's in a group of relatively low social class people doing sports. In this case, it seems to be trick shooting with crossbows, and it has it on his hip. And then about 50 years later, around 1450, you start seeing depictions of them being carried by knights. And they're going into battle wearing armor with a messer. And by the 1480s or 90s, you're seeing messers being gifted by princes to other princes as diplomatic presents, in effect. So there is this social strata that it's climbing. It's gone from being the peasant's knife to being a house knife or a Bauernwehr to a Hauswehr or house weapon to being a knightly weapon to being a princely weapon. It's then being found in hunting, so that you're going off hunting, and that's a social activity, especially of the upper classes, where they're showing off their wealth, they're showing off their class, and all of that. It's a society of conspicuous consumption. You want to show off how tasteful and how rich and how influential you are. Um, And in this, they're putting messers on their hips, often with antler
Mm.
as the grip material. So it's specifically related to the hunt. I'll show an example of that later on. It's very definitely a sort of an evolution of the weapon over time, um, becoming the most popular piece for an entire strata of society. I touched on the subject of the difficulty of naming of them.
Yes.
Um, we are sort of using, well, we can't avoid using those names because they've
Hmm.
become part of popular consciousness. So There is no hard and fast rule. It's a bit like saying where's a short sword and where's a dagger.
Hmm.
At some point, it becomes a very long dagger or a very short sword, and there are blurry lines between these. But generally speaking, you have Messer, which are also called Bauernwehr and Hauswehr, which are small knife-like objects. They're from about a foot long, a little bit more than a foot, to perhaps 2 feet, 60 centimeters, thereabouts. Um, some of these are bigger, some of them are smaller. There are a rarer group of examples of these which are significantly longer. But these groups almost universally lack one critical example or one critical piece, which is a crossguard. And I'm
Hmm.
going to pull out an example for you to see at this point. We'll we'll put it on the table as well, but I'll do a bit of handling for it first. This is the example, and you can see the size of that. That
Yeah.
is more than 60 centimeters in total, but it has absolutely no crossguard at all.
Hmm.
And you won't be able to see on the camera screen there, but
Does have a
there
noggle.
is,
Yeah.
it has been Nagel,
Hmm.
if I get the angle right.
Yeah.
And just visible is the corrosion pattern, which is evidence that wood went as far as there. There was never any piece of metal protecting this as a crossguard. So these are all a relatively short messer type. You then get the Langus messer, the long knives, which almost universally will have a crossguard. They may have a pommel, some do, some don't. A lot of these are quite aggressively tapered in thickness, and that changes the handling characteristics. You don't necessarily need a pommel to make it,
Hmm.
a good handling weapon. And those probably go from about 55 centimeters to 60 up to about 75 to 80 centimeters. Then you get Grossmesser, which are great knives, and those, again, tend to be a slightly larger hilt. They will possibly be big enough that you can use not quite two hands, but hands and a half on it. And the blades would probably be from about 75 up to maybe 85 to 90 centimeters. And then you get the Kriegsmesser, the war messers, and those are definitely heavier weapons. They are very solidly built. They have often large cross guards, much bigger nagels which protect the hand. One or two of them have side rings, but not
Hmm.
many. And those have much bigger blades of going up to about a total length of about 1 meter 25, 90 to 1 meter 10 for the blades themselves. So there's a clear sort of logical progression of these
Hmm.
different sizes, but some of them will be six of one and half a dozen of the
Yeah.
other, and exactly what it would be in terms of a classification or a naming is something which often you really can't make your mind up until you handle it. You might go, oh, this is actually quite light and agile. I don't think this is a war messer at all. Or it's like, oh, this is much choppier. I think this one was used for fighting. So there is a lot of interpretation
Hmm.
and extrapolation from the evidence. And some it's obvious, if you get something which is absolutely massive, it's going to be a Kriegsmesser, and some are incredibly delicate.
Hmm.
I have an example of a hunting messer here, which I'll show later on, and that is the same kind of thing. It's very much a delicate construction. I don't, well, in some ways delicate, in others it's quite robust, which makes it quite a challenge to understand what's going on with these. But I believe it's for hunting, and you can look at the example of how delicate the hilt is, and you sort of get an interpretation of what sort of society this was being used for, what sort of social structures, and the intention behind it. And so each of these has a different development over time.
Sure. Now,
So that was a couple.
now, you mentioned briefly at the beginning when you came up with your typology that you had basically the blade types with the option of either hilt being available to them. In practice, do you see archaeological evidence for all blade types being represented on Messer hilts? For instance, finding Type 1 style, Type 1A style blades on a Messer hilt.
Very rarely. There are one or two outliers. The most common sort of example of that is you get short hunting Messer truce sets,
Mm.
which are groups of them, where you'll have almost like a meat cleaver, which has a similar profile to that, but in general carry for an actual individual weapon. The early Type 1 and Type 2 blades, which you find on falchions, almost don't exist for Messers. They very much sort of develop and appear in the later period, 14th century, with things like either what we class as Type 5, which are very sort of sword-like
Hmm.
spear points, or you have clip points of the Type 3s, which do have some degree of crossover with falchions, and they are very similar in shape and form, um, but with different hilts on them. You also get Type 4, which are the
Mm.
groups which have often curvature and Yellman, which is the raised quill at the back of the blade. Um, and those sort of appear in more central and southeastern European contexts. And I suspect what's going on there is influence from the Ottoman Empire into Austria and Hungary and those sort of areas. So there is cultural crossover going on there, which influences blade forms. And these might have been described as an Eastern style blade or something like that to these people. And those in turn end up influencing and cross pollinating with sabres, which start appearing at that period, which is an entirely different rabbit hole to go down, I think is the best way of putting it, and one which someday we'll have to all be sort of cross-reference against the early periods of those two groups. Um, so there's definitely sort of influence going on there.
Yeah, so you touched on that kind of tangled serpent's nest as you start dealing with Eastern Europe and the introduction of sabers and how they may interplay with this. Something else that we should mention, you mentioned how you can kind of track the rise of status of messers through artwork of the time. We mentioned in the last video how falchions were depicted in medieval art, and they have a kind of important allegorical use. I think it's also worth mentioning that once messers show up on the scene, we can basically see them used in the same way as falchions. Basically, they are used kind of interchangeably in the same stories. For instance, David and Goliath, the crucifixion of Christ, some of the Greek tragedies where you have these non-Christian foes. It takes on the role of the single-edged sword,
Yes.
conveying the same message to the viewer. Correct?
It's absolutely the case. I think that there's a visual shorthand which is being used in medieval art. And it's like the black hat and the white hat in westerns in the 50s. You know that the baddie is going to have a black hat, and you know that the person who's not the Christian is going to have a single edged choppy sword because it's not quite that Christian ideal. I think I may have touched on the fact that I think this entire sort of conceit or idea of that comes from probably the Norman
Mm.
um, church in Western Europe, and so it spreads across most of Western, but not fully into Central Europe. And so there is a little bit of a difference of the societal stigma of a single-edged weapon. And I think that's part of why they become fashionable over there.
Mm.
It's a difference in sort of church doctrine or social values. And it's very easy to sort of say, oh yes, Europe, we're all the same. But you've got to remember that these are, you know, dozens, hundreds of different countries and city states. And what's considered acceptable in one is considered outrageous in another. And, you know, there's probably sort of cases where, you know, the grandmother of the house is saying, "Oh, those people from Cracker wearing pointy shoes, it's a sign of sin," and all of that. In fact, there's a good example of that in Italy, with one of the Doge of Venice who married a Byzantine princess,
Mm.
um, and that terrible harlot of a woman ate her meals with a fork. As a
Barbarian.
result, God struck her down and killed her with the plague, as she deserved. It's like, yes, a fork was considered to be, you know, harlot's tool for eating with, and disapproved of. You can't sort of say that there is one set of values for all of Europe. And in this context, I think Central and Eastern Europe had much less disapproval, shall I
Hmm.
say, much less sort of reticence to carry a single-edged weapon. They considered it perfectly acceptable, and over time it becomes not just acceptable but fashionable. And I don't think it becomes the majority.
Mm.
Um, you know, I still think messers were a minority weapon when compared to, say, the two-edged sword, but they certainly become common enough to be
Mm.
popular. And the archaeology sort of supports this. I think I mentioned how there's only less than 40 falchions
Hmm.
circulating in the world. You can find 40 messers in one single country. There are hundreds and hundreds of those all around the place, as evidenced by the fact that I have a couple sitting on my desk here.
Oh, that sounds
So,
promising.
yeah. Well, you've got a hint of one there, and there are more to come. So I'll demonstrate these examples later on there. It's very much a case that because they become so ubiquitous, we have a much wider surviving body of evidence. Um, I think I talked about river finds as
Hmm.
being a wonderfully democratic process of archaeology in that no one type of sword is more likely to jump out of its scabbard and go flying into a
Mm.
river. And so they're a great example of the rates of survival of objects. And so we only have a handful of river finds of falchions, just half a dozen or so. Um, we have hundreds of messers.
Yeah.
And so that really sort of demonstrates that they're much more common in the wider scope of Europe as a
Yeah.
whole.
Spectacular.